So this commentary will begin in a few minutes, just at the point that the RKO studio logo fades in. My name is Benjamin Kirstein. I have been a film critic for The New Ledger, The Federalist, and various other publications. And this is a commentary on Orson Welles' extraordinary and very tragic film, The Magnificent Ambersons. And I'm doing it purely for my own pleasure and I hope for yours. So the film will be starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, now. This film has obviously become fairly legendary for the worst reasons. It's very ironic to see these credits echoing those of Citizen Kane, one of the few films with absolute control for the director, and here a film that ended up with essentially no control for the director, as this beautiful narration by Welles starts to come in. I think one of the greatest narrations in film history. This film is probably one of the most tragic ever made, and certainly one of the most notorious incidents of a film being destroyed or very nearly destroyed by a studio over the director's objections. And very much in contrast to these beautiful, nostalgic scenes with which the film begins. So I'll be talking a great deal about that. And also I think of the place that this film holds, for better or worse, in the career of Orson Welles and in cinema history. I think it's fair to say that this film is pretty much universally regarded as maybe with the possible exception of Erich von Stroheim's Greed, as the greatest loss in the history of cinema, the most sort of egregious travesty, let's say, committed, the greatest crime, let's say, committed against a director's vision, and possibly robbing us of what certain people, I think Peter Bogdanovich is the most prominent one of them, regard as having been potentially one of the greatest American films ever made. People have speculated that it may in the end have proved superior to Citizen Kane. I doubt that. I think Citizen Kane is such an innovative and influential movie that I don't think anything that Welles followed it up with could possibly have overcome that in terms of its significance and its place in cinema history. But I think Bogdanovich is probably right in the sense that historically speaking, in terms of the history of cinema, this would have been an extremely important film, and maybe one of the most it seems one of the most emotionally affecting American films ever made, and one of the most significant in terms of its view of America, and in terms of which that view was really ahead of its time, and that view is a very dark one, and that was one of the things that ultimately led to the film's eventual destruction. I think it's fair to say, certainly the destruction of Welles's original vision for it. And it's very interesting that the film, in a way, sort of echoes the story of the film itself, in that it begins with great hope and great sentimentality and great love for the material, and also great innovation with this beautiful montage, sort of giving you in a very short period of time a whole sense of a bygone era, of a way of life that no longer exists, but that may possibly have been better than what we live today. You know, he's saying that famous line where Welles says, "The faster we're carried, the less time we have to spend," and these it's very funny, it's very touching, it's very beautiful, and is so efficient in the way that it's put together, that it also has that spectacular kind of showmanship that Welles always had in his films, and this is precisely the kind of thing that the film itself was meant to demolish over the course of the story, if you like. It would be a film that began with this and then became darker and darker and darker, and finally ended in I think what might have been one of the darkest scenes in cinema history, at least from what we can glean of what it would have been. And that also is the story of what happened to the film. It was embarked on with great love and great hope by Welles, and was actually very much loved in its original version by the head of the studio, who was a great supporter of Welles. And then a series of disasters occurred that resulted in the near total annihilation of what Welles was trying to do. This first part, by Welles' own testimony, and I think, let's say the first third to the first half of the film, by Welles' own testimony, and also by what we can glean from the clues we have as to what the film is actually like, is relatively speaking intact. This film was cut and substantially reshot over Welles' objections and in Welles' absence by RKO. Most of that meddling occurred in the second half, and especially the last third of the movie. This part here, there's some small cuts. There's a handful of individual shots, individual comments by the sort of onlookers, and there's one sort of significant scene at the end of it that's taken out, but by and large it's left more or less intact, and there isn't a great deal of damage done. And I think certainly what Welles was trying to do with this sort of opening part of the film is not in any way vitiated by what the studio did, and there's a reason for that, which is that it did not disturb what the studio wanted to do in terms of changing the film, and one of the major purposes of changing the film was to make it less dark and more amenable to the sensibilities of a 1940s wartime, early wartime audience. And this opening part obviously did not offend anyone's issues having to do with a film that was too dark or too depressing. Just to explain sort of how we even have an idea of what the film may have been originally like. Almost nothing of what was cut and reshot from the film remains in any moving picture form. There are a handful of little scenes that remain actually in a trailer that was dug up I think about 20 years ago, maybe a little more. Over and that was eventually released when the film was released by Turner Classics, which actually does contain a handful of shots of from the original cut, and a few sort of fleeting seconds from the famous final scene that was cut, and that Welles said was by far the greatest scene in the film, and I mean, to actually see it is so extraordinarily tantalizing and affecting and sad to see those that brief moment from that final scene. It's an extraordinary find, but unfortunately, there's really nothing else left. There is a great deal of documentary evidence. There's Welles' original screenplay, which was changed in certain regards, mainly in regard to that final scene, but which does give you a pretty good idea of what the original was like. There are stills, production stills. This part here begins this extraordinary, the great ball for George Minifer's return from school. it's just one of the most magical sequences in cinema, and is not in fact left intact, but I think does convey what very beautifully what Wells was trying to get at. The biggest change made in this sequence is actually, interestingly enough, although the scenes overall feel is left intact, it's one of the most egregious changes made in the film, because this scene, I believe, was originally shot in essentially entirely in one take. In other words, I mean, obviously it wasn't, it's too long to actually be shot in one take. They only had, I think, 10-minute film magazines back then, but it was faked so as to appear to be shot entirely in one take, and there were breakaway walls and all kinds of other production design tricks that were used in order to do this. But as you can see, there are these back and forth cuts and these much more conventional kind of editing, because I think the sequence was considered to be too long, and the studio basically started hacking out bits of it and fading in and out of certain scenes. But I believe most of it originally was shot in order to appear to be one single unbroken take. Wells said unequivocally that it was the great tour de force of his career, and I have no doubt that was the case. I mean, it would have outdone the famous opening shot from Touch of Evil by a country mile, and I think even enough of those long tracking shots remain in order for you to imagine what it must have been like. The actress here with Tim Holt is so heartbreakingly beautiful. It's it's really remarkable. I think she was 18 or something like that when she played this role. Went on to appear in a bunch of John Ford westerns, as did Tim Holt. I can't remember her name at the moment, which I'm very ashamed about. Getting back to what I was talking about in terms of the available evidence, let's say, of Wells's version, there's one of those fades. That shot, I think, was meant to continue all the way up the stairs. There's also a reference to a scene that was cut from the opening sequence where George actually comes home, and the first thing he does is he goes to the club, a sort of secret society for young people that he's been a member of, and basically bullies everybody into making him president. And it is kind of an important scene because it lets you know that he hasn't changed, and he's still a bully and a spoiled brat and all the rest of it. But and it conveys that before you get into this dance sequence where he's trying to act as charming as possible. But its loss, I think, doesn't really demolish anything. You know, it's nowhere near as egregious as some of what goes on in the rest of the film. Anyways, returning once again, there are production stills left from the scenes that were cut out, including a production still of the final shot, which is of Joseph Cotton's character getting into his car and sort of disappearing into the industrial wasteland that this town has now become, partly because of his own invention of the automobile, which I there's some controversy over where that still is. I'm not sure it's quite certain, actually. That may have disappeared as well. I don't remember precisely. But the most important piece of evidence we have is RKO's own, ironically, RKO's own cutting continuity, which is a document that's drawn up when a film has been edited and mostly finished, that is a very detailed description of that film, including camera movements, cutting, even cinematography, even where certain shadows fall even over certain characters and things like that. And that is an absolutely invaluable and the best piece of evidence that we have. And it does give you a pretty good idea of what the original film was like, and also how different it was from what the existing version is. It would have been a very, very different movie, much more slowly paced, much darker, obviously, much more tragic, and also would have given a great deal of context in terms of the economic situation of what happens to these characters, in terms of, that's there somewhat in what exists. You have this great aristocratic family who basically, because of the various economic changes brought on by the automobile, by Joseph Cotton's character, as you'll see, ultimately collapses as industrial America sort of comes in and wipes them out. That's much more present in Wells's original version, at least so far as we can ascertain. And the story as it now exists is mostly rendered emotional. It's rendered through the rival, this sort of Oedipal rivalry between Joseph Cotton's character Eugene and Tim Holt's character George over the mother, and that. And Aunt Fanny's role in that too, obviously, and which is present in the film, but is mirrored in the original. Excuse me, is present in the original, but is mirrored at the same time by the economic upheaval that sort of plows this family over, and the horrible 20th century comes in and wipes out this whole way of life. And I think also Wells's original appears to have made a great deal more sense because of many of the cuts and changes made in this film. There's a lot of very dissonant elements in it, and a lot of things that just don't fit together. And I think particularly, to be fully honest, once you hit the second half of this movie, it gets very confusing and oftentimes becomes very difficult to follow the story. Things sort of spring at you that don't make much sense, and these sudden changes in tone and continuity that just become very hard to sort of sort out, especially on first viewing. And I think oddly enough, even though one of the studio's complaints was that it was hard to follow the story, in doing what they did, they actually made it harder to follow. As in many things, they ended up making all the problems they were citing even worse. Times old, they're dead. There aren't any times but new times. One of the most marvelous lines, and this is such a vertiginous shot, watching them dance off towards the camera. Wonderful. And then the two of them who will be rivals coming up behind. Wonderful, wonderful sequence. Beautifully staged, this entire sequence, obviously. And of course, in the original, the camera also had to be staged, and so they were dancing, and the camera was dancing with them, which I think must have been extraordinary. Extraordinary to see. The process by which this film was destroyed is a very controversial one, and everyone has the people I love this line, a yachtsman, and then they dance off in the opposite direction. They're wonderful, and then they disappear into the crowd. It's beautifully done, and I think it fades here. Yes, it fades to. Yes, Joseph Cotton and Mother Amberson dancing alone to the last of the strains of old time music. Wonderful, sort of nostalgic, sentimental, unapologetically sentimental. Sort of something that's very rare in films today. Films love irony, and there's no irony in this scene, really, which is what makes it so ironic later on. Funnily enough. Anyway, everyone, people who love Wells, people who hate Wells, people who are simply interested in film history and in the unmaking of this movie, everyone has their villain of choice in this story. Obviously, Wells's critics mostly blame Wells for it. Some people blame Jack Moss, who was Wells's business manager, and actually did some of the reshoots. Some people blame George Schaefer, who was the head of RKO and who had brought Wells into RKO and had basically given him the extraordinary contract for Citizen Kane and given him full creative control and let him do his thing, essentially, which was to make the greatest film ever made, certainly the most significant, I think, sound film ever made. But Schaefer, we'll get to Schaefer later. Wells himself actually blamed Robert Wise, who edited the film and later became a very famous and respected director in his own right, and I think basically felt that Wise had built his directing career essentially on having reshot portions of Ambersons, which were his first directing assignment. Essentially, was directing those reshoots. And I think Welles basically saw that as a kind of Machiavellian career move on the part of Robert Wise. I think Welles' attitude toward Wise is very unfair, and I'll get to that later. Some people obviously blame simply RKO itself, and then by extension the entire Hollywood studio system. Obviously, there's something in that. RKO was the entity that cut the film, or ordered the film to be cut and reshot and all the rest of it, and then actually fired Welles as a result, threw his company, the Mercury Company, off the lot, which included actors like Joseph Cotten and all the rest of that. I think it's one of those situations where in some ways everyone was to blame and no one was to blame. There was very even RKO can't be entirely blamed, I think, because what happened in terms of the reason why this film was as Jim McBride, Joseph McBride, excuse me, who wrote a recent book on Welles, describing what happened to Ambersons. This is a classic example of Welles's chiaroscuro cinematography. It's wonderful. These black figures, these silhouettes against very minimal lighting. Stanley Cortez shot this film and shot it famously slowly, according to Welles, and he later on put significant blame on Cortez for this film did run over schedule and over budget, and he did blame Cortez for quite a bit of that. Excuse me while I light a cigarette. What happened with this film? What really killed the film ultimately was a preview that was held in Pomona, California. And there's a couple of things that need to be understood about that, which is that Welles at the time was not in the United States, and in fact was not in the United States during the entire recutting and reshooting of this movie. He had been sent to South America on as a sort of goodwill ambassador to make a kind of a semi-documentary film about Brazilian culture, and was basically stuck down there in the aftermath of Ambersons. He had been promised that the print of the film would be sent to him, which I believe it was, which of course has now become a holy grail for film researchers, trying to find that Brazilian print, which probably, in all likelihood, unfortunately, does not exist. No available print, by the way, of just to make it clear, the original, as far as we can tell, exists absolutely nowhere and was completely destroyed. There do not appear to be any existent prints or any existent film material of the original, except what appears in the trailer, which is a handful of seconds, really. And people have searched for it. People have speculated that it may be in Brazil because it does seem to have been sent to Welles and things like that. But it doesn't. That doesn't appear to be the case. At least no one has uncovered much evidence that there's the possibility that it still exists. But it has become a kind of holy grail for film researchers to find Welles's Magnificent Ambersons. It's the great. It's like the 10-hour version of Greed. It's the great treasure of the great lost treasure of film history. Anyway. To return from another digression, Welles was not in the United States, and it's important to say that Schaefer, who was still head of RKO and still a supporter of Welles, when he first saw the film, loved it, and actually wrote a letter to Welles talking about how much he loved it. And interestingly enough, see this scene here with Agnes Moorehead as Aunt Fanny, said that Agnes Moorehead was just absolutely extraordinary, one of the greatest performances he had ever seen, and I completely agree with him. She's magnificent. And the brilliance of her performance does remain in the final film, thank God. It's the tour. It is, as Welles was in Welles's words, it's the tour de force of her career, I think. Certainly having ended up on Bewitched, It's nice. It's very wonderful to have this extraordinary performance there to sort of overcome some of the roles she had to take later in her career. Schaefer's support for the film essentially collapsed, and he has this very famous, wonderful scene in the sleigh riding scene in the snow with the automobile. This is one of the most famous beloved sequences in the film, shot under extremely arduous conditions because Wells insisted on seeing the breath of the actors, which had not been possible in a winter scene in Citizen Kane, where the lawyer comes. Agnes Moorehead is also in that scene, actually, where the lawyer comes and takes Charles Foster Kane away from his parents for the first time. The breath is not seen in that, which always bothered Wells. So this entire set, this is a studio set, was built inside essentially a giant freezer, a giant icebox, and I think Joseph Cotton caught pneumonia or something like that, and everyone was freezing their asses off. And you can see the breath. I mean, it does provide a certain realism. It does not at all look like a studio set, and it is again filled with this kind of wonderful nostalgia, with this slight hint of what's to come, because there is Eugene's machine there spewing out these noxious fumes into this beautiful snowy scene, and Eugene's smile there has always intrigued me. So strange, all things considered, in terms of his love for George's mother and his affection, this sort of very close, sort of quasi-Oedipal or Electra relationship with his daughter. It's a very ambiguous moment. And of course it ends with that beautiful Iris Out, that homage to the great silent films, a wonderful effect which is terribly underused today. Martin Scorsese actually has started to use it in some of his films, thankfully. Something that really, I think, needs to be brought back. Its association with cartoons, unfortunately, has been, I think, ruined it for a lot of people. In any case, Schaefer loved the movie and praised it to the skies, and praised his and Wells' professional relationship and artistic relationship, all the rest of it. That was completely destroyed by the first preview of the film, which was held in Pomona, California, and convinced the studio, and I think convinced Schaefer as well, that they had an absolute disaster on their hands. And for a host of reasons, that threw them into what was essentially a blind panic, and in a very short amount of time they reshot and re-edited the film into what it is now. It was a process that took only about 2 months, I think. It happened very quickly. Wells really didn't know what was going on, and I think he was deliberately kept out of the process in a lot of ways. And by the time he was able to return to the United States, it was over, essentially. There was nothing to be done. And the original print, as far as anyone can ascertain, had been destroyed already. I think had been destroyed already. The Pomona preview is very interesting because what basically happened was, and I think this is one of the greatest tragedies of all, is that you essentially, it seems, because the preview cards still exist, and it seems from the preview cards that you had basically a completely polarized audience, with essentially people either loathe the film with a really kind of relentless passion, this sort of really intense emotional hatred for the movie, and then you had a group of people who thought that it was the greatest movie they'd ever seen, and were just absolutely blown away by it, stunned by it, and just regarded it instantaneously as a great work of art. Unfortunately, it does seem that the people who hated it were very much in the majority, and actually were very vocal, and laughed at the film, jeered at the movie, booed it, and things like this. And even, I think, for the minority that loved it, themselves, some of the preview cards say things like, it's just a shame that ordinary audiences can't appreciate this kind of great art. Here's this wonderful Yeah, this wonderful iris out. And this sort of does mark, that moment does sort of mark the beginning of the fall, as is, shown, I think, by this musical cue. And the shadow of Joseph Cotten, it does sort of begin the process by which the downfall is going to take place. And it is obviously a funeral. It is the moment in which Minifer Sr. dies. Very beautifully done in this kind of quiet way. Anyway, the people praise the film, but making statements like that at the same time, we're in essence saying this film can't be a popular success. So none of that helped. I mean, the people who loved the movie didn't help the studio's attitude either. It's a wonderful look on Agnes Moorehead's face here. At any rate, essentially the reaction to the film demolished the studio's faith in it and Schaefer's faith in it. And the first thing they did was start to cut things down. This scene is actually an example, because one of the biggest complaints in the audience is that the film was too long and too slow. So the first thing they started to do was to hack bits out of the movie. Now there were several scenes that were taken out, like the club scene, the secret society scene at the beginning. Actually, those that were taken out, in some ways, many of them are very egregious. Some are not even necessarily as egregious as some of what was truncated from scenes that remain in the picture. In this scene, for example, and to me this is a very clear indication of the studio's reason for doing what they did, this long conversation in this very, very long take fades out, I think, after Aunt Fanny sort of loses it and marches out, and the Ray Collins character gives a kind of... I have amnesia about the names of some of these characters at the moment, I apologize, but Ray Collins, who's wonderful in the film, and who was in Citizen Kane as the corrupt politician who destroys Kane's political ambitions. Wonderful actor, and he comes in and he makes this sort of final statement that Aunt Fanny doesn't really have much except her love for Eugene and things like that. And that scene continued with Ray Collins looking out the window and talking about the new housing developments that are being built sort of off in the distance, and how it's kind of starting to encroach on them, I think, and things like that. Which again brings in the economic context, which was very much taken out of the movie, except for a sequence at the end, which I think is one of the most extraordinary moments in all cinema, and thank God was left mostly intact. And Welles' narration to it is absolutely heartbreaking. This is one of the examples of the studio sort of, the first thing that they did really was to try and cut the length down. And so they started snipping bits off of scenes, and which then led into taking out entire scenes that they felt did not work or did not advance the narrative, and especially, I think, were too dark. Because that was the other big complaint, was that the film was depressing. The film was too dark. The film was, and keep in mind also that it was to be shown. It was previewed right as America had gone into World War II, and people complained also that we don't need this kind of movie right now. That runs us down and all the rest of it. At any rate, that then led to reshoots, because some of those scenes were essential. Simply in advancing the story, and the idea was then to soften the tone of those scenes and to rewrite them and to shoot them in a different way, to remove this kind of deep, hard focus that Welles is such a part of Welles' style, and to give it a softer look, and to use more close-ups to make it more conventional, if you like, production of the time. It is important to note that I think the film ran something like 2 hours and 20 minutes in its original form, which was long for that era, and they cut it down by a substantial amount. I think it runs about 80 minutes now, or 85 minutes, which was not by any means, it's short by today's standards, but it was not really short for the standards of the time. I think many, if not most features at this time were released at around 90 minutes or slightly more. It was not at all unusual for a film to run an hour and a half. And so they cut, I think, something like 50 minutes or something, or perhaps a bit less out of it, and then and obviously then some scenes were reshot. So it is important to note just how much of this film is not Wells's. It does not belong to Wells in any way. So there's a kind of there was a kind of slippery slope that happened. They started, it began with sort of shortening things. It led to cutting things out entirely, and then it led to reshooting. And everything was to make the film more palatable to the audiences of the time. And this, unfortunately, I think even today would be an unpalatable movie. And in some ways that is Wells's fault, in the sense that the whole point in making the film and Wells's whole vision for the movie, which is very much to his credit, I think, was to make a dark film, and he said that was the point, and it's just he felt the film was so good that it would go over, and was unfortunately wrong about that, because and this is something that's very much part of Wells's style. Wells's films have a very unusual dramatic structure, right from Citizen Kane and right to the end of with Chimes at Midnight, which is that unlike if you like the conventional Hollywood film, which starts off in a kind of normal with a sort of normalcy, it then rises up to a climax of a sort of catastrophic moment in which everything has changed, and then it comes back down again to a sort of either new normalcy or back to the old normalcy. That's sort of the basic structure, and is based, if you like, on sort of classic tragedy, even classic Greek tragedy in some ways. It's a much more palatable sort of variation on that sort of classic structure. Wells often begins on a very, very high note, and then begins to sort of drop off, and becomes sort of darker and darker and darker, and then there's the moment, if you like, of there is often a moment of catastrophe, and then he leaves you there, whether it's with the burning sled, the destruction of the remains of Charles Foster Kane at the end of Citizen Kane, right up to Prince Hal's rejection of Falstaff in Chimes at Midnight. He doesn't let you come up again, and he forces you. It's a very honest kind of vision, but very, very impalatable. And I think even today, it's not something that audiences like or enjoy. And I think Wells's films will always struggle to be popular successes, and will always be, I think, somewhat elitist in their following. Because of that reason, it's hard. His films are hard to take in an interesting way, although they're often very fun and very amusing in parts. But they are not, as a whole, easy to deal with. There's such a realistic look to this sequence. I love it. This carriage riding sequence, one of several. But there's such a look. It was so clearly shot in natural light, and has this that the continuous take gives it such a wonderful texture, a sort of feel of being in that moment and in that time. Very influenced by John Ford, I think, who also has an extraordinary, almost physical texture to his movies, and it was a huge influence on Wells. And right to the very end, Wells adored John Ford and would testify to that, very, very generously, and did so all his life. There's a famous story about him watching Stagecoach over and over and over again before making Citizen Kane in order to get how movies were made. At any rate, so I think for RKO, I think, and for Schaefer also, what they did to the movie was really purely a business decision. I mean, they were scared to death, and they thought that they had a relatively expensive for them, film on their hands that was going to be a disaster. They weren't just going to have a failure; they were going to have a disaster, and they now believe that they very well may have made the worst film in history. And they panicked. They absolutely panicked, and no one really had a clear idea of how to deal with it. They had a clear idea of what they wanted to do, which to obviously to somehow turn this around and make the film into some kind of popular success. Which because it was such chaos and panic involved, they completely failed to do that. The film was not a popular success and didn't even match the success of Citizen Kane, which was also I think Citizen Kane at the time barely broke even, which was one of the reasons also why they panicked, because they didn't have faith in Wells's ability to play at the box office. But Ambersons certainly, I think, came through in the red and was a dead loss for the studio in the end. And had they, ironically, it was kind of terrible irony, had they left the damn thing alone, it might, not have, it might have failed in the same way as the original did, but they wouldn't have lost anything. I mean, they were going to get what they were going to get. It seems like they engineered its failure instead of just letting its failure happen. If it was going to fail, it may not have. We'll never know. Never had the chance. Although I doubt it would have been a huge hit, just given the tenor of the times and the nature of the film itself. At any rate, the panic that ensued, led to was really on the basis of a business decision on their part, and I think, to be fully honest with you, if you look at it from their point of view, they can't, really necessarily be blamed for that. I'm going to have to digress here because this is such a magnificent scene, very famous scene among cinephiles. Very much a kind of classic sort of Wells moment. And this does retain the issue of economic change and how it's going to affect this family, and also does make George look pretty bad, which is also one of the things they tried to change later on. And it contains also, I think, perhaps Joseph Cotton's greatest moment, the extraordinary speech he gives where he's holding the spoon and speaking about what the automobile is going to bring, and how it admitting and anticipating the horrors that industrialization in the 20th century is going to bring, it's difficult for me to say because I also love Cotton's performance in Shadow of a Doubt, which is just magnificent, wonderful combination of charm and menace, and maybe Hitchcock's greatest villain, and interestingly enough, the greatest moment in that film is a dinner table speech where he gives that horrifying speech about women being like animals and all the rest of it. But I think this moment tops it. He's got the spoon here, and it's so understated and so beautifully played in this quiet voice, that they won't add to the life of men's souls, that there's going to be a spiritual death that occurs. There's going to be a spiritual degradation along with the economic degradation and environmental degradation that this kind of industrialization is going to bring, and the kind of change that's going to come. Very much reminds me of Walter Benjamin's concept of the angel of history, where he refers to the storm of progress and the angel that's being thrown forward by the force of the catastrophe, and he wants to go back and make whole what's been smashed from the past, and the storm of progress is pushing him forward, and the ruins piling up behind him. Very, very much reminds me of that allegorical image, that quote-unquote progress can be as destructive and as retrograde, if you like, as a more static form of life, a sustainable form of life, if you like, traditional, I should say, a more traditional way of life. But yeah, and then what I think what Ray Collins says. He says it a bit later on about how that's one way to woo a woman, by insulting her father. It's a great line. Dolores Costello, who plays George's mother in this, blanking on her name again. I can't believe it. Very daunting sometimes doing these commentaries in real time. Was a great silent film actress, as was the actor, I think, who plays Major Amberson, the George's grandfather, who was also a star of silent films. She was revived really by Wells, and this was kind of him trying to do a kind of comeback role for her. She's amazing in the film, and beautifully portrays the kind of fragility and regret that the character has, and it's also a marvelous deep focus shot there of Ray Collins by the fireplace. This is a famous scene also, the camera, I think, rising up the stairwell and stuff. The point, Dolores Costello, Wells told the story that her face had been so ravaged by the heavy makeup that they used in silent films that she had to be heavily made up all over again before every shot. It's very sad. She looks a little bit to me like Catherine Deneuve, actually, in Catherine Deneuve's later years, and along with pretty much all the other performances in this film is absolutely magnificent. And here's one. And this here is one of Agnes Moorehead's classic moments. Agnes Moorehead, despite the fact that her performance here is now revered as probably her greatest role by I think pretty universally revered, was actually the target of most of the audience's hatred in the preview. They simply found her ludicrous and annoying. That may have something to do with actually her voice. She has a very shrill, sort of irritating voice, which is, I think, obviously intentional, because she's so highly strung, and obviously there's that extraordinary scene near the end, which is left about half intact, where she just absolutely loses it and descends into a kind of hysterical psychosis. But it was also not a time when there was much sympathy for spinster women and stuff. And as McBride notes, today I think there's a great deal more, after feminism and stuff, there's a great deal more sympathy for these kinds of female characters who are trapped really by circumstances beyond their control, and where they're just, they cannot marry and therefore cannot in any way escape their situation. But I think at this time they simply viewed her as this terrible harridan and this awful woman who's causing all these horrible things to happen in the house, and helping in the destruction of this family, and this kind of selfish, sort of vicious old maid, this kind of horrible witch, and they absolutely hated her, there were some scenes that I think were reshot in order to make her appear more sympathetic, as was George. George's character in the original is particularly in the second half, is far more dislikable than he is in the final film. He's still pretty dislikable in the movie, just because there was only a certain amount they could change really without making it ludicrous. But he's really horrible in the original version, and his redemption, such as there is much less emphasized, mainly by the change made in the final scene. I've always loved this scene. I don't know why, because the two of them are so toe-to-toe, him and this actress. He's trying to intimidate her, and she's one of the few characters in the film that just won't let him, and she and she gives as good as she gets, and finally just goes, "Get out of my house." I think it's a wonderfully funny scene, it's a shame in a way, because this, even with what we have, it's so clear that this is Tim Holt's greatest performance, and is such so unique also in Tim Holt's career. Unfortunately, he really always remained a supporting actor, and even a kind of bit part actor. Wells himself said that it was, commented on how much of a shame it was, mainly because he became part of John Ford's repertory company and ended up mainly in supporting roles in westerns. He actually plays one of the soldiers in Stagecoach, and his greatest role besides this is really his part in The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, where he's also brilliant and holds his own completely with Humphrey Bogart and Walter Huston, and I think gives a terrifically noble performance without ever seeming to be over the top. yeah, this is another one of Wells's great. Shooting into the mirror with everything in focus. One of the almost in focus. It's slightly out of focus. Tim Holt just slightly. Very, very hard to get deep focus shots in this era. You needed a ton of light and very. You were very restricted in some ways in what you could do. Only Greg Toland really could have developed it. One of the great geniuses of cinematography, one who shot Citizen Kane, and one who Wells always spoke of with enormous, almost reverence, and as being as much a contributor to Kane as he was, or as anyone else. Wonderful shot there. Might be a process shot, not entirely sure. A lot of special effects used in this movie, as there were in Kane. And this to me really is the beginning of the downfall. I think the beginning of the film's downward slide, or the family's downward slide, and of George's descent into into a kind of Oedipal murder of his mother in a sort of weird twist on the Oedipal relationship. George destroys his mother essentially, and out of possessiveness and out of pride, I suppose, jealousy. And the first step is destroying Joe Cotton. Yeah. The look on Cotton's face there is fantastic. Those close-ups might be reshoots, but I don't think so. I think those were shot by Wells. Very hard. It's sometimes like, picking cherries, trying to figure out, what's Wells and what's them. You know what I mean? Because they did sort of mash things up so much. It's all tangled together in some cases. It's terrible. Terribly. So much pathos in that. Just that shot of her sitting there in her going out clothes, Those figures far in the distance, but still in focus. I mean, again, another great example of... Stanley Cortez did do an extraordinary job on this film. He may have done it... Yeah, this is the famous shot rising up. Classic Wells. Shooting up through the... up the stairwell. Some marvelous low-angle shots, constantly moving. There's... Wells really had it out for Cortez, and I think that Cortez was... there are other things I've read about him being a difficult guy to work with. He actually was the first cinematographer hired to shoot Chinatown by Roman Polanski many years after this, and Polanski had to fire him and bring in, I think, John Alonzo because Cortez just was so slow and didn't really seem to know what he was doing. I imagine he knew what he was doing with this film, but. He was very slow and apparently kind of obsessed with detail and of getting everything right. It is on the screen. I mean, the film is it looks astounding, but it did stretch the budget and it did stretch the schedule, and the film did end up over budget and over schedule. And Wells put a lot of blame on Cortez for that. Maybe not entirely fairly, but in the same way, I think Wells sort of focused on a handful of people who he really blamed for this, and one was Wise, and one was Cortez. Yeah, it was one of Moorhead's great scenes, and I think also probably one of the scenes that the audience really hated because she's so whiny and borderline hysterical here. But I think it's terribly affecting, and I think that's the opinion of most people who view this movie today. Yeah, she's just so desperate, And of course, they're all plotting against each other. She really wants Eugene, that's why she's trying to keep her from talking to him. Interestingly enough, Wells did a radio production of The Magnificent Ambersons, which ironically again eliminated the character of Aunt Fanny, but he did a radio production before he made this film, and the Joe Cotton character was actually played by Walter Huston, which I think is funny considering Tim Holtz later role alongside Huston in Treasure of the Sierra Madre. This is also a very, very affecting moment. This was echoed in a later, much later scene near the end of the film that was cut. I think it was cut. This is when the film really starts to take the turn into pathos and into sadness and into darkness. What was taken out from that was the fact that it was echoed in the economic circumstances, and also that it was sustained throughout the rest of the movie. And I think that was really ultimately what the audience couldn't take. That the way that there was just no let up, that it was a continuous descent, and that there was no relief given, and that from here it became even worse, and then got worse again, and it was just too much for people. And again, I think it might even be too much for people today. I'm not sure if this movie was made today that an audience could take it. Films like this, are in some ways doomed to initial failure and are only later sort of reevaluated in the light of the immediate reaction to them tends to be a kind of hostility, because they attack you in a way. They get under your skin in a way that's very uncomfortable. And plus, there is this thing of, it goes very against certain formulas of American movies. For one thing, the idea that love conquers all, and that the star-crossed lovers will eventually have their moment of either going off into the sun together or dying together, like Romeo and Juliet, in this wonderful romantic climax. And this film, that doesn't happen. They never get together, and they never sort of find a way to consummate this romance. It remains forever unfulfilled, and I think that's one of the terrible things. This is, I think, the first major scene that was substantially reshot. And it was directed by Robert Wise. This is one of the scenes that I believe that was directed by Robert Wise. The dialogue was rewritten. The visual style is a bit softer than Wells. It's a bit less interesting than Wells. In the original scene, which is actually portrayed in the radio play with Wells playing the role of George, it's an absolutely horrifying scene. He essentially destroys her and subjects her to a kind of emotional abuse that he just breaks her in two, just snaps her in two, and browbeats her essentially into giving up Eugene. In the scene here, he's much more ambivalent, much more kind of pained, and doesn't really know what to do, and he's like this troubled child, and she ends up comforting him at the end of it, and sort of, she takes him in her arms and treats him like, a poor lost child, and it makes George much more sympathetic. Whereas in the original, it is the final nail in the coffin of any sympathy for George. This is the classic moment here, I just don't know, sadness in his eyes and all that, sadness in her eyes and all that. You can also tell that the lack of focus in the close-ups there is very much not Wells. Her putting her hands on his head. It's completely the opposite of. It's also very dissonant from what his character is in the previous scene, and the way he's treated Eugene so far, and it's the first example of the studio really just being willing to throw out the film's stylistic and emotional continuity in order to preserve in some way just the very basic story continuity, because in wanting to get rid of that scene, they couldn't have gotten rid of that scene, without completely eliminating the the whole reason why Eugene and his mother go off to Europe. So they had to in some way keep it in, and so what they did was to do a kind of castrated version of it, essentially. And that scene, it's that scene in the original is really the kind of nail in the coffin of George's character. You can't feel anything really for him after that. You know what I mean? And I think it would also change in some ways your sympathy for him in this scene, because her treatment of him, and this kind of blasé treatment of him in the context of the way he'd earlier treated his mother, I think would have seemed very different, and really does show how much you can change the whole story of a film simply by cutting, simply by portraying a scene slightly differently or radically differently, as I did here. God, she is so stunning. It's just you can't take your eyes off of her. She really is. Wells isn't noted for having beautiful women in his films, but the way that he shoots her is really, those eyes, the way he brings out those eyes and stuff is marvelous. She's also brilliant in the movie, like basically, as I said, like basically the whole entire rest of the cast. She's wonderful. There's a wonderful combination of innocence and worldliness. She has a worldliness that you don't expect, and she's very, very smart. She's maybe the smartest character in the whole movie, and even though she loves George and loves her father, she's kind of got them both figured out in a way that they don't. She knows more about them than they know about themselves in an interesting way. Very unusual female character, I think, particularly in this era, and I think she's very, very appealing. This was her first role, I think. This was her debut, and then I think she was picked up by John Ford and starred in My Darling Clementine. I know she's in, and she never really became a huge star, but she's there in a lot of some of the more interesting films of the 40s and 50s. This scene was changed at the end. There's a close-up inserted, which is completely out of context and just totally dissonant in terms of the context of the rest of the scene, and just portrays her is so sort of heavy-handed, and it comes along, I think, right around here after she says goodbye, and yeah. Yeah, that one right here. This gauzy close-up of her looking sad is completely ridiculous, and of course, it destroys also the impact of what's going to happen here, because now that she's totally distraught, and whereas before I think it would have come much more suddenly and been a more had a lot more impact, I think, in the way it was done. There was also a brief shot of the townspeople talking about how she fainted dead away and the rest of it, I believe there were some scenes cut in between this scene and that scene, in this scene and the previous scene, and so I think there's a dissonance here too, because you don't get a sense of how long George and his mother have been away. Isabel, thank you. Her name's Isabel. The character's name is Isabel. I love the composition in this scene, the way they're sort of, especially where he puts Joseph Cotton in that black suit. Again, very, very, scene with a lot of pathos in it. Ray Collins is again marvelous. This is really, I think, where the film starts to go off the rails. Wells placed it as saying around the time Major Amberson dies. I think it actually comes a bit earlier. I think it's around here also that the story starts to fall apart, and you really start to feel that there's things missing. There's just things that aren't just don't go together and don't make sense, and the whole movie starts to unravel on you. And I remember when I first saw this, I just kind of didn't get it. I didn't understand what was going on, particularly into the second half, and it became, kind of very confusing and almost incomprehensible in some ways, and really came away thinking, this is actually sort of a bad movie. After having seen it a couple of more times and sort of looked into what it went on with it, the bad things are now much more explainable in terms of because they're undertaken by the studio under conditions of lunacy almost, and also having looked into what the original was like, now the film makes a lot more sense even watching it in this version. But I think for first-time viewers, I think this film can be awfully hard-going, and probably more hard-going than the original version was, simply because the original seems to have made more sense. There's also a long sequence cut here, or excuse me, right after this scene where they're in the carriage, which was, according to Wells, was a long scene of her being taken out of the carriage and then carried, as an invalid into the Amberson mansion and then into her bedroom, and would have given you a very strong sense of just how ill Isabel is, and of the wages of what George has done to her, and I think that scene is also truncated in terms of time. I think it was also a shot largely without dialogue, which was and a very long single take, which is very much in Wells's style, and I think would have been very powerful. I think this scene was a reshoot. To make Eugene look more assertive, and to make the others seem more sympathetic. Fanny crying, for example, saying, "Oh, you shouldn't go up because she's so ill. You just shouldn't see her." Whereas, before, it was just George keeping him away again with this kind of endless vindictiveness. This I think was shot by Jack Moss, and again you can see here it's done in imitation. It's the closest reshoot to Wells's style, and it actually isn't so bad. It gets something of the feel of what the rest of the film is like. It's not as dissonant, but I do think it again makes the story so problematic because it's not as it's not. The rewriting and the different emotional tone of it is less in keeping with where the film was going before. And also this shot of him watching Eugene leave doesn't really make sense, unless it's George's vindictiveness that's kept him away, Oh, I can't remember. And again, also I can't remember if this is a reshoot, partly a reshoot, Wells's original. It's honestly sometimes difficult to pull everything apart. I think it's Wells's because of that pattern on the, that beautiful webbed pattern on the pillow there and on her face. But again, it's much more in keeping with George being manipulative because here he's lying to her basically, and then to put the more sympathetic scene before that, it just makes George look out of sync with the descent of his character, with the whole way his character's been built up, and the way that his obsession with his mother and with the family honor, if you like, has led him into becoming this monster. He's a terrible, terrible person, really. She really does look ravaged in this scene. So heartbreaking. I'd like to have seen him. Yeah. And she knows she's going to die. She knows that there's nothing left really. And then the netting fall. Yeah, this is Wells, I'm pretty sure. That pattern falling across her face. This is just devastating scene. Absolutely brilliantly staged, starting on Major Amberson, just looking, and Bernard Herrmann's music here is wonderful. Also, you can see him in the child's room, in George's room, it seems, and then Aunt Fanny. Ugh, I think that scene went on in the original, and this here is both the most extraordinary sequence in the film and the most ridiculous change that they made. Wells's narration is wonderful. The performance of the actor playing the major, again, his name has escaped me, is magnificent. He was actually so old he couldn't remember his lines here, and Wells was speaking them off camera, which is why there's so many pauses in what he's saying. But this speech went on for a few more seconds after this, and climaxes in this absolutely devastating, heartbreaking line where he's talking about the origin of man, and we came out of the sun, and we go back to the earth, and then the earth came out of the sun. So, and then it fades out into black in the middle of that speech, inexplicably. And in the original screenplay, if you read it, he went on and says, "So time means nothing at all, and in the end, we'll all be back in the sun together." Which is, to me, in so many ways, the essence of the pathos of this movie, and the sense of loss in this film, and the sense of a world lost, and a family lost, and people lost, and of time passing, and time wiping everything out. And there's nothing sadder to me than the passage of time, and to take that away, and for absolutely no reason at all. I mean, what did they gain by cutting that out? I mean, you lose a couple of seconds off the end of this speech. It makes absolutely no sense to me. It's the most egregious and the most stupid change that they made. It still makes no sense for me. Yeah, and it just goes away. There's just no sense to it all. It then faded in the original to a shot of Major Amberson and Isabel Amberson's gravestones. So you knew that the Major died also. And one of the biggest continuity errors in the recut version is that Major Amberson just goes away. Nothing's ever said about what happened to him. It doesn't make sense. So it's just kind of like, well, he's just gone. You sort of have to guess. You sort of figure, okay, he was old, he probably died, but it was made very clear in the original. No idea why they took that out either. I think it's ridiculously stupid. This scene, I think, began earlier. The scene was longer and had a sort of longer speech, but the essence of what the scene's getting across is still there, and it is Wells's. Wells said that the whole second half of the movie is meant to describe how they all slid downhill, in one way or another, quote unquote. And I mean, that's clearly here that he's saying also that when he says they're in a state of bustitude, and that they're all, there's no money left. Basically, that was outlined that was much more detailed. The reason why they went under in the original, because it went through how they sell off their land to these new residential units, and then there's smoke coming in from an automobile factory that's been built to build Eugene's machine, and then his wonderful new invention is spewing smoke up, so the area around there is no longer desirable, and they keep having to sell off pieces of the land at a loss, and so ultimately they go under. So basically, the family goes bankrupt. More or less, and this is would have been just kind of a final comment on that, whereas here this is sort of the first inkling you get, really. It's the first explicit mention you get of how bad they're. I love that scene of him running off into the smoke, of how bad off they've become. Always interested me that they left this scene in. It is a wonderful scene between the two of them, and them talking about Minnehaha and the Indian names for these things, and it's a wonderful, whimsical, sort of sad but also charming sort of scene, and the interaction between the two of them is wonderful, but again, it's very strange. I don't know why they left this in, because it doesn't advance the plot. It isn't really particularly upbeat, or anything, and it doesn't, but they left it in pretty much in its entirety, and I think maybe just because it's a little more up, it's just a little less dark than some of the other scenes, so they figured maybe the audience needed a relief, and so they kept it in for that reason. I don't really know. I suppose this may be, and maybe at a later point, also the time to talk about my view of Robert Wise's role in the unmaking of this movie. As I said, Welles basically pinpointed Wise as the villain of the piece. He basically said, Wise, you can't blame him enough, quote unquote. He said he was the one who did everything. He was the source of the whole thing. I think that's really untrue, and Wise was not Welles's guy. Wise was not a member of the Mercury Theatre. He was a staff editor for RKO. He was under no obligations to Welles. RKO told him to cut it, and he cut it, and he was given an opportunity to direct. I mean, what was he going to do? Turn it down? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. All he could do was resign, and to ask a guy to sacrifice his career for the sake of a single film, I don't think that's at all fair. And I also have a suspicion, and I do not know if this is true at all. This is just speculation on my part. I have a feeling that some of the scenes from the second half that were left in, strangely left in, and seems like, why didn't they cut that? Why did they leave that in? That seems like the type of thing that they would cut. Particularly the scene that's coming up with where Aunt Fanny really loses it. Those may have been saved by Robert Wise. I have a feeling he was, as you can see from his later career as a director, he was a man of artistic taste, and he's admitted that the film was better in its original form, and it was just that they did what they had to do, for business reasons. But I wonder if maybe some of the good stuff, some of what Welles did that remains in the second half, I wonder maybe if Wise was the reason that some of that was saved, and maybe this scene as well. I don't know. It is one of those classic, slow, long-running scenes. Yeah, now this scene to me is the perfect example of what the studio did to this film, because it is literally cut into two halves. This first part is the studio, the second part is Welles, and you can smell the difference between the two of them. Cinematography is different, the performances are different, the whole tone of it is different. You can see that this is shot in much softer focus. Fanny is basically a very pathetic character in this in the first half. She's very sad. She's desperately trying to defend herself, and she's really quite sympathetic, and she's talking about how she doesn't have any money, and she just needs she doesn't know what to do, and she's kind of lost, and she's crying, and this is very much what the studio was trying to do, is to lessen the impact of these scenes and to make them less emotionally brutal on the audience. And quite frankly, what remains of this scene, which again, I have suspicions maybe because of Wise, but what remains in the second half of the scene, I think is by far and away the most emotionally brutal scene in American cinema of this time. You just didn't see it in cinema. You didn't see the kind of emotional intensity that this scene builds to, and I think they wanted to lessen that as much as possible. Again, my suspicion that Wise may have been involved is that there's no sense, if they reshot this entire scene, why didn't they just leave it like that? Why did they leave in the second half? And I think it cuts right around here. Yeah, that close-up is totally not Welles in any way, Yeah, and this... I tried, and I don't know what to do. It's so sort of melodramatic, and sort of everything being done to make her look more sympathetic. And there's this very jarring cut that's coming up here, which is completely into Welles. She's talking about how much she's done, and how much effort she's put into it, and it just makes her look sad and pathetic, and then in Welles's version, you realize that actually she's gone completely nuts, and she's borderline psychotic. She's and it's so important because it's everything her character has been building to: the repression, the frustration, the sexual. Here it is. There's the cut. This is Welles, and you can see the difference. She starts shrieking in this terrifying way, And this is also the climax of her character. she's finally exploding. And here, she just, yeah. I mean, that's so far beyond anything you saw in movies at this time. And she just goes completely insane, and then the camera hurtles back, and her performance is so powerful. It's almost as if she's blasting the camera back with the force of her insanity. You know, this breakdown, this explosion she's finally had after hiding her feelings and her emotions and who she is, and then all of her frustrations for so long, and she just busts wide open. And again, it's a little inexplicable as to why they left this in, and I think Wise may have had something to do with it. It may have been one of those things they managed to save. Wells. It's also very sad because Wells said, you know, if you'd only seen this at full length, you know, you had no idea, you know, that Moorhead just would have destroyed you. You know, I completely believe that. And I heard audiences laughed at this scene, and I imagine in that case it was nervous laughter. I mean, I think this scene is so devastating, and in terms of what remains in this movie, it might be the best scene in the picture, at the very least one of them. I mean, it's so daring and so it's so strong, so powerful and intense, you know. This scene is Wells. I think you can kind of tell because of the humor in it. I think probably they left it in because of the humor. The actor playing this sort of pompous, ludicrous lawyer played the rather beleaguered first editor of the Inquirer in Citizen Kane, and is even more hilarious in that. He's sort of a stock Dickens style comic relief character, you know, wonderful caricature. He's hilarious in that, I think, in Citizen Kane. He's you know, he's not quite as funny in this, but he's clearly, you know, sort of humorous. And I mean, obviously they left it in also because it's necessary for the plot. You know, you need to know why that their economic situation is now so dire that he's got to go to work in explosives and all the rest of it. The problem obviously is that the economic breakdown. Again, this scene is so sudden. There's nothing leading up to it. There's no hint as to just how broke they are until the scene with in the train station, and then this scene. You know, you get no context for what's happening here, and again, this is one of those things that I think seems so strange to someone who comes to this film fresh and maybe doesn't even know the extent to which this film was bastardized, you know. I think it's awfully the picture of Woodrow Wilson up there indicating the time period. The attention to detail is marvelous. You know, set design, production design is extraordinary. The Ambersons mansion and you know, it really is marvelous. This is, for me, the best scene in the picture, and I think one of the most moving moments in cinema history. And Wells's narration is so devastating. And again, you don't have the build-up to this, but I think this scene redeems the whole economic theme. You know, town befouling itself and darkening its sky. This apocalyptic vision of what industrialization has done. They got these shots just walking around L.A. in a handheld camera. With a handheld camera, shooting these things. Very daring for that time. Very unusual to shoot with a handheld camera. Actually, almost unheard of. And then this terrible judgment coming down. You know, George Amberson Miniford got his comeuppance. You know, and again, the theme of the passage of time. Those who were living had forgotten all about it, forgotten all about him. There was a scene that was taken out in the middle of this, of a long tracking shot through the Amberson mansion with more narration from Wells detailing what's been lost and things like that, and of the empty Amberson mansions just stripped of all its furniture and everything, and now not at all the beautiful thing it once was. I think the sequence maintains its impact despite that loss. I think it's absolutely devastating, and it has so much to do with Wells's gift in terms of using his voice and his gift as a vocal actor, and rolling over. You know, it's just absolutely devastating. And I mean, in the original, you can only imagine what this would have been like with the long build up to the breakdown of the Amberson fortune, and you know, you've really seen it happen piece by piece and bit by bit. I mean, you know, who knows what it would have done to you then. We'll never know. it's important to know that there's a myth about this film that Wells's career was destroyed by it. That's not entirely true. His career as a Hollywood director was basically badly damaged by it, but he remained a successful stage actor, a successful radio actor, and a successful movie actor, and a writer, a journalist, and things like that, and went on to remain in the public eye for a long time. And it was only really when he went to Europe to work with Alexander Korda on a series of films that never got made eventually that he sort of dropped out of the public consciousness. I think this scene is a reshoot. This final scene this whole final sequence is a very bad reshoot meant to give the film some kind of a happy ending. Wells's original ending was what he called the best scene in the picture. From what we know about it, it is not just a downer; it's a completely devastating downer, in which Joseph Cotton goes to an old rooming house where Aunt Fanny is now situated, in this terrible, rundown place by an elevated subway filled with old people who are thrown away sort of at the end of their lives, and he sort of, the dialogue on Cotton's part is largely the same. He tries to tell her that he feels like in spirit he's been reunited with Isabel, and she's watching over her boy again, and she's with him again, and he's been true to his true love, and all the rest of it. And Fanny just kind of sits there in a state of almost catatonia and doesn't respond at all, and then he goes out and gets into his car and drives off again to this horrible industrial wasteland. And I think the meaning of the scene is obvious. It's that, okay, he's been true to his own true love. He's been true to the morals and the mores of his time in his mind. But that time is gone because of what he's done, and the invention that he's created has created a time in which all of those values and everything about that era, the values of that era, the mores of that era, the beauty of that era is now irrelevant and destroyed. And that to me is really, this is Wells's lamentation on that, and the loss of that scene is the loss in some ways of the film. It's the loss of what Wells was trying to do, and I think it underlines also just in a way the loss of this film, because what we have here really is bits and pieces of a great film trying to push its way through the sort of flotsam of what they did to it, and I think in that sense, in a weird way, it's weirdly appropriate. It's meant to be, it's a tragic film in its undoing about a tragedy. It's a tragic film that was tragically undone. Wells saw it once and started to cry, and they said, we understand why it makes you sad, and he said, no, it's not because of what they did to it. That just makes me angry. It's because it's the past. It's over, which I think is ultimately what The Magnificent Ambersons is about. What of it that still survives is what it's about. These spoken word pieces are very interesting, because Bernard Herrmann and his music did not appear in them. He refused to be credited because of the cuts. Resulted in his score being substantially changed, and he refused to be credited for it. The one man, in a way, who defied the whole process of its unmaking. In any case, I hope you don't mind taking such a sad trip through this film. It is a wonderful film, a beautiful movie in so many ways, and beautiful despite being marred, and maybe in some ways because of being marred. It fights to be seen, no matter what was done to it. And I thank you very, very much for listening, and I appreciate you indulging my self-indulgence. Thank you very much.